Okay, welcome back, everyone. Welcome to panel 3, Media Technology Across Asia. We want to welcome Dr. Barbara Watson Andaya. She's a professor in the Department of Asian Studies here at the University of Hawaii, and she's going to be our moderator for this panel. So Dr. Andaya will be introducing the panelists, and then we will have each person present for 15 minutes, and we'll save most questions for the end. And I will be sending out really quick, I'll be keeping time, and I will send through the chat a 3-minute warning, a 1-minute warning, and then a wrap-up warning. So without further ado, Dr. Andaya, if you want to take it away. Oh, you're muted.
Yes, well, thanks very much, Caitlin, and thank you all for being here this afternoon. I'm very interested, very excited actually, to hear these papers because all of them by young scholars touching on very topical and interesting aspects of media technology. So we'll go through with the order that they're listed on our program. And our first speaker is Joeita Das, who is from the University of Hyderabad, and she is going to speak on a fragment of the digital Mahabharata. Our second speaker is Nicole Yee, and she's from Chulalongkorn University at the moment, she tells me, doing a master's, but originally, I think, from Singapore, Malaysia?
Singapore, yes.
Singapore, yeah. And she's going to be, her topic is, her paper is entitled Unread Hikayat Recentering Malay Oral Historical Tradition in an Age of Print Technology. Then we'll have a video representation from Shang-Yu Wang, who can't actually come online, but he's sent us a video presentation, and he's looking at didactic narrative and memory production on bamboo slips from dealing with the period of the warring dynasties. And then finally, somebody I do know quite well now, Sarah Sweeney, who is my advisee, and she's from UH, of course, and she's going to be talking about gender mainstreaming in water resources. So we'll begin with Joeita. Are you here? Yes, oh, there you are. Sorry, I'm looking in the wrong column. Welcome to the panel. And would you like to go ahead now with your paper on the Mahabharata, an episode in the Mahabharata?
Right. Thank you so much. Just one thing, I'm not from the University of Hyderabad. I'm from the English and Foreign Language University, which is in Hyderabad, of course.
Oh, yes, sorry, yes. Yes, in Hyderabad, well, from Hyderabad, but English and Foreign Language, my apologies.
Right, no problem. Okay, I'll go on and share my screen. Is my presentation visible to everyone?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So greetings from India. This is Joeita Das. And today I am going to be talking about a fragment of the digital Mahabharata. Now, why do I call it a fragment? Because this was a group project, and I'm going to be talking about my part only, which is a fragment of the larger project. What is the Mahabharata? Well, very briefly, the Mahabharata is a Mahakavya, or an Indian epic composed by Veda Vyasa. Vyasa was an Indian sage. I have explained what do I mean by a fragment and what is the Mahabharata very briefly. Now let us talk about the digitization of the Mahabharata. Jatis or castes are one of the central aspects of Indian culture. The Indian subcontinent is inhabited by countless jatis. There is a Sanskrit shloka that says, Jatis are ananta, or endless. To talk about them is impossible. These castes or jatis are never-ending, ever-evolving, and internally self-dividing biocultural formations. these biocultural formations were engaged in something called the responsive reception. Responsive reception takes place when a culture responds and reflects on receiving something. For instance, the Mahabharata of Vyasa is received and reflected upon by various cultures, giving rise to multiple cultural Mahabharatas. Better to say, multiple cultural manifestations of different episodes of the Mahabharata. We will look into some of them in the following slides. Now, these jatis or biocultural formations have employed various modes of communication to articulate their responses and reflection of the Mahabharata. Before jumping into it, let us look into the history of communication. The various modes of communication that have been employed by various cultures to articulate their creativity and inheritance include the oral or verbal mode, the gestural or visual, the inscriptional, the audiovisual, and the digital. Each mode was replaced by the preceding mode due to their limitations. For instance, oral and gestural communication is possible only within proximity. They cannot be recorded. They are utterly short-lived. They form the basis of mnemocultures. They generate and transmit cultural memories through embodied activities, such as singing, storytelling, dancing, acting out, painting, and so on. The inscriptional mode, which replaced the oral and gestural modes, displays a desire for immortality. It is not short-lived. However, it lacks the explanatory voice and animation. Thus, the inscribed scripts are prone to misinterpretation. Thereby, a new mode was devised that included an explanatory voice besides animation. That is, the audio-visual mode of communication, such as cartoons. Unfortunately, it misses out on the textual part. Thus, another mode was devised, which was an amalgamation of all the major cultural forms, such as image, music, text, and performance, which is the digital mode. The only constraint of the digital mode is the lack of improvisation, which means once something is digitally recorded, it cannot be improvised. However, the digital mode could be used to preserve the mnemocultural articulations along with text and animation, leaving no scope for misinterpretation. So let us see which jatis have adhered to which mode of communication to articulate their response to the Mahabharata. The Mahabharata has got multiple episodes or parvas. Today, we are going to be looking at the episode of the disrobing of Draupadi, which is a part of the Sabha Parva. The oldest mode of communication happens to be oral or the verbal mode. I have chosen two retelling of the Mahabharata in Bangla as instances of oral responsive reception. One is by Kashiram Das, while the other one is by Kali Prasanna Singha. The Mahabharata that has been recomposed by Kashiram Das is known as the Kashi Dashi Mahabharata. On the other hand, the one that is recomposed by Kali Prasanna Singha is known as the Kali Prasanna Mahabharata. The Kashi Dashi Mahabharata is written in poetry format, while the Kali Prasanna Mahabharata is in prose format. These narratives were recited by Hindu Brahmanas before their learners and disciples or before people of mundane origin. I'll play a bit of both and extract from the Kashi Dashi Mahabharata first. Notice the rhythm. Is it audible? So this was a bit of the Kashidashi Mahabharata, and as you have noticed, it goes in a rhythm. Now I'm going to play a bit of the Kali Prasanna Mahabharata.
তদন্তর দুঃশাসন সভা মধ্যে বলপূর্বক দ্রৌপদীর পরিধেয় বসন আকর্ষণ করিবার উপক্রম করিলে দ্রৌপদী এইরূপ কৃষ্ণকে চিন্তা করিতে লাগিলেন, হে গোবিন্দ।
So that, like both of these audios, they describe the same episode, one in a rhythmic format, which is more poetic, and the other one in a more, a narrative format. The oral mode was replaced by the visual mode of communication. Instances of visual responsive receptions can be seen in Baluchari saris and laterite plates. The Baluchari sari first. Baluchari saris are typical to Bengal. Allegedly, the Baluchari weavers seem to be a part of the Patua or Pota weaving community. This community of weavers have their exclusive folk song known as the Patua Sangeet. These songs mainly narrate various mythological episodes. In all probability, these small-scale weavers used to hum one such tune while looming the verbal into the visual. Thus emerged such beautiful embroidered depictions combined with the artisan's impression of mythology. Up next is the laterite plaque, the picture that is below, that was sculpted during the rule of the Malay dynasty in India. The rural sculptors who sculpted these plaques were supposedly not very literate. So somebody would narrate an episode of the Mahabharata to them, and they would engrave the episode thus narrated by integrating their impression of the same episode, thus engraving the verbal into the visual. What preceded the inscriptional mode was, the visual mode was the inscriptional mode of communication. Upendra Kishore Roy Chaudhary's children's illustrated Mahabharata is a notable instance of a responsive reception adhering to the inscriptional mode of communication. The inscriptional mode was replaced by the audio-visual system of communication. I would like to show you portions from the Bengali animated Mahabharata, which I have chosen as instances of the audio-visual responsive reception. Sorry, just a moment. So that was a bit of the animated version of the disrobing of Draupadi. And all of these cultural responsive receptions can be brought together and further reflected upon with the help of the digital platform. The digital Mahabharata is an instance of how an amalgamation of technology and literature could be employed for the preservation of the diverse cultural manifestations of literary compositions, such as the Mahabharata. Such an application of the technical and humanitarian disciplines would eventually give rise to a digital museum. This museum would enable the future generations to connect with the repertoire of cultural or regional manifestations of a literary composition, which may or may not be practiced subsequently. That is all I had to say. Thank you so much for your patience.
Thank you very much, Joyita. That was very interesting. If anybody has just a short question for clarification, it could be asked now, but otherwise we'll save all our questions for the end of the panel. So is there any short question just for clarification? If not, then we'll go straight on to Nicole's paper, and you need to unmute yourself, Nicole, and you can go ahead now.
All right. Okay. All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Nicole Yee, and I'll be introducing a part of my work titled To Unread a Hikayat, Recentering Malay Oral Historical Tradition in an Age of Print Technology. And so the question I want to ask is, how do we interpret Malay oral texts when they're not legible by the conventions of written works that we are accustomed to reading? And so here I hope to articulate a methodology for doing so. And for this, I have studied a Malay text, the Hikayat Anggun Cik Tunggal, or the Tale of Anggun Cik Tunggal. Now, this is a text that originated in oral performance in the Minangkabau region of West Sumatra, but was later printed and distributed in urban centers of the Malay world. As a work of oral performance, it was always changing, as each new storyteller might add, subtract, or elaborate on the story. And in its oral form, it was seen as history. Anggun Cik Tunggal was a Malay prince, and indeed the Minangkabau people of West Sumatra believed themselves to have been descended from him. But once this was put into print and reinterpreted by colonial scholars, this story became something quite different. It became a finished work of Malay folk literature. In effect, this was a Malay oral text that lost its historicity in its shift from the oral medium into the print medium. And this development was significant because as we take a closer look at the Hikayat, it reveals that this was a historical commentary on colonialism in the Malay world. So the portion of the tale that I want to analyze in some depth here narrates Anggun Cik Tunggal's efforts to recover the dignity of his kingdom after an attack by Portuguese invaders. A look at the opening scene sets up this line of narration. In this scene, we are introduced to a Portuguese king known as the White Viceroy. He sits in his chambers plotting his next conquest. The Portuguese king has already acquired many colonies, but nonetheless has further designs to invade a Malay kingdom that was a center of maritime trade. Later in the scene, he does succeed and thoroughly desecrates the country. This sequence of fictional events is hauntingly reminiscent of the traumatic Portuguese invasion of Malacca in 1511. Like the Malay polity that the White Viceroy invades, Malacca was a bustling entrepot city. In Malacca, merchants traded in spices and other sought-after merchandise. The Portuguese seized and sacked Malacca and also ousted its Muslim ruler, all with the aim of gaining control of the Indian Ocean spice trade. In the wake of Malacca's humiliating defeat, colonial powers ruled the city. The port changed hands and switched from Portuguese to Dutch rule in 1641, and the British colonized Malacca from 1824 to 1942. Likewise, in the Hikayat, the Malay royal lineage is cut short and the kingdom is ruptured from its past political glory. But to be sure, there are certainly many differences between real historical events and those in the Hikayat. In the Hikayat, it is not Malacca that the Portuguese invade, but rather they bombard instead the Malay kingdom of Tiku Priaman, which was in fact never a Portuguese colony. Instead, they had been under Dutch control from the 19th century. So here is a map of the two polities which lie straight apart from each other. But even more problematic in this story is the description in the Hikayat of the hero's revenge. In the Hikayat, the Malay prince Anggun Tunggal actually succeeds in slaying the Portuguese king. And not only that, he is warmly accepted by the Portuguese queen, who adopts him as her son, inducts him into the royal lineage, and gives him dominion over all the Portuguese lands. Even more striking, even still, he converts the Portuguese princess to Islam, marries her, and incorporates her into his own family line. The Malay hero secures military, political, sexual, genealogical, and religious victory over his European aggressors. The Hikayat therefore seems to be a perfect revenge fantasy, and indeed colonial scholars have branded the Hikayat as fictional literature because it does not correspond with a Western historical record of what really happened. But in fact, this Hikayat was taken as history by the Minangkabau. Modern scholars studying the Hikayat Anggun Tunggal have skirted this issue. They grant that the Hikayat may reflect historical reality in a vague and general sense, and they shelve discussion about the Hikayat's historicity to instead embark on a literary study of the text. But I contend that the Hikayat was not merely vaguely historical. In fact, it participated in a systematic and complex Malay historical tradition. To uncover the historicity of the Hikayat, we will need to unread it on a few different levels. First of all, we will need to undo artificial colonial genre classifications of the text. And I'm thinking more critically about how the Hikayat told history on terms that did not cohere with European expectations of history. But yet my approach is not purely literary. As a book historian, I am interested in looking at Malay historical texts, not as disembodied linguistic entities, but as a tradition of meaning-making, whose historical logic is a product of media technology, be it its oral or physical medium. In other words, I consider the historicity of a text to be a product of the material and social conditions surrounding it. When a storyteller told the Hikayat orally, each storyteller's version of the Hikayat was bound to be different from another's. And this was not a threat to the integrity of the historical knowledge they created, as Malay storytellers did not expect that the historical account they presented would be a stable representation of the past. Rather, storytellers constantly retold Malay history in response to their present socio-political contexts. To say the least, Malay historical accounts are not factual or definitive accounts of what really happened. The present is not a privileged vantage point from which Malay storytellers generated knowledge about the past. So the boundary between the historian's present and the object, the past, was extremely porous. And one's telling of the past could actually have an effect on the present and the future. Indeed, Malay storytellers retold versions of the past such that if those events they described should come to pass, it would create the conditions for a future that the teller desired. This explains why the Hikayat represents Malay victory over the Europeans as history. The Hikayat was told in West Sumatra, possibly following the Padri War of the early 19th century. Dutch colonists had begun to consolidate control over the Minangkabau region, and they did so at the expense of the agency of Malay local leaders. Under the Dutch, local political order had begun to depart from traditional systems of Malay rule. Tellers of the Hikayat Anggun Tunggal responded to this present state of political rupture to envision a future in which they were not under Dutch dominion. In envisioning such a future, storytellers were actually instantiating it. But still, a question remains: why is it that the Portuguese and not the Dutch feature in this tale? And for this, we must return to the significance of the 1511 Portuguese invasion of Malacca. This event was traumatic, and what I mean by that is that the invasion demanded to be continuously rememorialized. Indeed, many other narratives in the Malay world have reimagined the 1511 invasion. Theorist of historical poetics Hayden White provides, with his analysis of the mode of causal figuration, a means of helping us understand the poetics of the Hikayat. So given two events, an early event A and a later event B, that are not cause and effect, a historian retroactively constructs a relationship between them. And through this relationship, event A thus prefigures event B, such that one would have to refer to event A in order to understand event B to be a fulfillment of A. Likewise, an understanding of B makes one's consideration of A even more complete. So even though they are not related in terms of material cause, the significance of these two events are entwined. And I suggest that a similar poetics were at play in the domain of public memory in the Malay world. The violent 1511 invasion became, in Malay public memory, not only a trope of European colonial violence, but this was a threshold moment that would set future colonial encounters in the Malay world in this mold. So even if later Dutch and British colonial impingements on other parts of the Malay world may not have had anything to do materially with the Portuguese invasion in 1511, one would first have to revisit the trauma of Event A, or the 1511 Portuguese invasion of Malacca, in order to consider the later Event B, or the later Malay-Dutch or Malay-British interactions in the 19th and 20th centuries as a fulfillment of Portuguese invasion from centuries ago. The Hikayat's Portuguese invasion of Tiku Priaman may appear at first to be geographical slippage, but what was really at play was that the Hikayat was retelling local Minangkabau history in the mold of the 1511 Portuguese invasion. And simultaneously, it also rememorialized the traumatic 1511 Portuguese invasion with respect to present Minangkabau political concerns. So what kinds of claims then did the Hikayat make about local Minangkabau politics? Again, we cannot merely consult what is said in the text to know this, because it doesn't make any direct references to Minangkabau politics. So we then return to the oral medium of the Hikayat. In oral performance, the most important part of an account is that which is repeated most frequently. And for the Hikayat Anggun Cik Tunggal, the part with the most repetition is a very lengthy scene of the marriage festivities between Prince Anggun Cik Tunggal and a Portuguese princess named Kaca Bertuang. So Kaca Bertuang only appears at the very end of the story, and Anggun Cik Tunggal had in fact been wooing another woman, his Malay betrothed, for the whole duration of the story. But the printed version of the Hikayat devotes 10 whole pages out of a total of 159 pages to a description of Kaca Bertuang's wedding to our prince. It describes everything: the kinds of food they eat, how many times they make love, even the kinds of game stall vendors in town during their nuptials. So in the process, Anggun Cik Tunggal converts Kaca Bertuang to Islam. And in Malay practice, the Portuguese princess's conversion allows her to masuk Melayu, or to enter the Malay fray, or to become Malay. Non-Indigenous people who become Malay are traditionally no longer said to be European after their conversions. And from that point in the story on, the Hikayat's audience takes Kaca Bertuang to be, for all intents and purposes, Malay. By making the Portuguese princess Malay and according this moment great care and detail in oral performance, the Hikayat rewrites the tragic end of Minangkabau colonial history itself. By recasting dominion at the hands of an external force in domestic terms, the Hikayat inducts a once aggressive European other into the Malay self and explains away their present political rupture. So far, we have seen how, in order for a text to be a work of Malay history, it needs to change in order to serve the political demands of the present. So my next question is, can a historical text lose its historicity? And I contend that yes, in fact, it can. So I continue in the vein of thinking about historicity as something that is materially and socially contingent. And I'm considering historicity not as something that is innate to the text, but rather it is a product of the way the text is read. At the turn of the 20th century, Malay urban elites came to read the Hikayat as literature and not history. And they did so because the material and social conditions surrounding their readings of the Hikayat were changing at the time. In the 1900s, the colonial scholar Richard Winstead recorded a telling of the Hikayat Anggun Cik Tunggal, and then in the year 1914, he published and distributed it as a printed school reader for urban colonial schools. Because of Winstead's intervention, urban literates thereafter read Malay oral texts like the Hikayat as fixed works of folk literature. The rise of mass print technology did not only alter the discourse surrounding Malay oral texts, but rather print technology heralded in an age of print in which practices of consuming printed text was so pervasive that they created altogether new norms of reading. One of these norms was that texts are meant to be read as fixed and finished entities. The medium of print fixed specific performance contexts of each text by pressing these different cultural forms into an undifferentiated receptacle. In print, texts were in effect silenced. It no longer mattered how, where, or when a text, a piece of writing was read, because urban Malay elites consumed the text as a purely visual experience without imagining its performance context. But as we have seen, in order for a Malay text to function historically, it would have to be capable of changing with the times. So in reading Malay oral texts as fixed, Malay elites diffused the text's historical poetics. So this comes to my final point. As members of this age of print ourselves, it is crucial to visit questions of medium and technology when thinking about Malay intellectual history. As I have argued, one needs to unread fixed and printed ways of thinking about Malay oral texts in order to recover their historical purport. In other words, questions of media technology are important both to locate an indigenous intellectual history of colonial encounter and to account for the epistemic violence that wrested from an entire generation of educated urban elites this intellectual tradition of processing colonial trauma. Thank you, and I look forward to a lively discussion later.
Thank you, Nicole. And again, if there's any quick question for clarification, otherwise we can hold our questions until later. And now, so thank you very much, both of you, Joita and Nicole. So now we're moving to a different format. And I think Tasha is going to play a video from Shangyu Wang, who is from the University of Colorado and has sent us a video.
Okay, hello everyone. So today my topic is didactic narrative and memory production. As shown by my title, I will focus on two excavated manuscripts entitled 子范子语 and 晋文公入语镜, both published in the 7th volume of the Tsinghua collection of bamboo slips. So both texts involve the story of Prince Chong'er, who later became the Duke Wen of Jing, or Jing Wengong, one of the most well-known hegemons during the spring and autumn period. The text of 子范子语 provides some anecdotes about Prince Chong'er when he took refuge in the state of Qing in his long exile. In this text, the Duke Mu of Qing, or Qing Mugong, summoned 子范 and 子瑜, two of the most important assistants of Prince Chong'er, and cast doubt on the leadership of the prince, while these two loyal assistants defended their master. It also contains conversations in which Duke Mu of Qing and Prince Chong'er respectively consulted Jian Shu, who was the most important officials in the court of Qing, about the strategies of good governance. The second manuscript, 晋文公入语镜, introduces the good governance of the Duke Wen of Jing after his return to his home state. So here triggers some important questions to explore. So as we know, this text contains several didactic elements. So it's interesting to explore how do they interact with the narrative and what role do they play in shaping the memory of Prince Chong'er, and how was the image of Prince Chong'er interpreted? How was text used considering its historical context? And how this text revealed the evolution of political thoughts in the early China. So first, my argument was based on the assumption that these two manuscripts form a meaningful combination in a chronological order. As we can see, there are different levels of consistency between two manuscripts, both in terms of the materiality and its content. So based on the research of the editorial team in the Tsinghua University, we found that there are many similarities and connections between these two manuscripts. For example, so both texts will likely be written by the same scribe, and they also have the similar layout, and they have the similar position of the binding strings. So that points out the connections in terms of the materiality. Also, these two manuscript texts could form a meaningful combination in terms of the content, and it could be shown by the use of the authoritative framework. I suggest we pay attention to how these two texts start. So both texts start with the itinerary of Prince Chong'er, though the name used for the hero of the narrative was changed from the Prince Chong'er to Duke Wen of Jing, indicating the fact that he had seized the throne after his return. So such opening formulas not only put these two texts in a chronological order, but also construct an authoritative framework for the didactic content that flesh out it. And this will also influence how the audience will perceive these texts. And notably, so using the itinerary of the kings or the political figures as a frame, such practice was quite common in early Chinese narrative, especially in the bronze inscriptions. For example, in this bronze inscription, Tong Gui, it also starts with the movement of the itinerary of the king. Like the king was in the capital of Zhou and visited the Grand Temple, which also set a framework for the whole narrative. Okay. So as a representation of the past, considering how the text was used at that time, so the Warring States period was an era where rulers tended to perform various kinds of reforms and struggle to gain hegemony. It is nature for them to look into the past and set these influential rulers, including the rulers like the Jing Wengong in history as an example. Also, for those who try to gain positions in the government by promoting their political thoughts, Duke Wen of Jing could be a good candidate for the embodiment of their ideology. So I believe that these texts employ several narrative strategies to portray the imperfect Prince Chong'er as a successful ideal ruler, which makes him a perfect vehicle for certain political thoughts. So, however, the prince himself was imperfect. So the narratives do make efforts, employ several narrative strategies to make the imperfect Prince Chong'er become perfect. And as we can see, so at the start of the first part of the manuscript, Duke Mu of Qing, he interpreted Chong'er's decision to flee his states during the Civil War as a sign of lacking leadership and strength, and thus questioned his legitimacy as a successful ruler. He doubted that Prince Chong'er lacked the sufficient ability to make plans, as well as lacked the help from good assistance. So that's 谋心不足 and 无良左右. And then as I mentioned before, his two assistants defended their master. Well, I would suggest we can pay attention to the formal features of the didactic sayings in the responses of defendants from the And so that could be fall into two different categories. And in pattern A, or in the first pattern, the didactic speech consists of several short sentences that lists some traits of the personalities or character. It frequently takes the form of 什么而什么 and 不怎么怎么不 and what. So it may specify that an ideal ruler will do this but not do that. For example, from here, my lord will, and he is prudent and honest. He will not do, he does not take advantages of calamity to benefit himself and does not treat people badly. And here, it's like it's specified that my lord will not hinder helpful remonstrations, will not obstruct those who are capable. He will is sure to dismiss those who are evil. By contrast, in the second pattern, it appears focused on the examination of personalities. So in this case, Ziyu evaluated the personality of Chong'er by highlighting how he would react in a given circumstance of life, such as obtaining benefits and making mistakes. Such formal features share some kinds of similarities with the form elements in the Warring States texts involving the thing of diagnosing characters or cataloging people in the circumstance of recruiting officials. So when such things was placed in a new context like this, it indicates that Prince Chong'er actually, he had these widely acknowledged moral qualities required by the qualified politicians, which would ensure his success in the future. In this way, Zifan and Ziyu successfully defended him from the accusation that he fled his state during the civil war by providing the moral excuses to him. And also, as we can see in the second part of the manuscript, in which these two rulers consulted this Jian Shu about the strategies for ideal governance, the text tend to constructing Prince Chong'er as an ideal ruler who embodied the novice political thought that it is the mind of people that determines the rise and the fall of a state. So here, as we can see, he mentioned the Tang and the Zhou, and he highlighted how people reacted to Tang and Zhou, who different types of rulers from the remote past. Well, unlike the traditional explanation that attributes the success of a ruler to the endorsement of heaven, Jian Shu interprets the support from the people as a sign of ideal governance. So here we can see how people react to Tang and Zhou differently. And also, when Prince Chong'er consulted Jian Shu about the ideal governance, he also mentioned these foundational figures. So that's an important concept in the Assmann's cultural memory theory. So by mentioning these foundational figures, such political agenda becomes more persuasive. So if you want to make the state rise, you have to learn from those guys. Also, the text tend to guide the audience to believe that the accomplishment achieved by Duke Wen resulted from his practice of the ideology that the mind of ruler should accord with the mind of his people. So in the second manuscript, 晋文公入语经, it specifies that what the Duke did after his return to his state. For example, he reformed the judicial administrative system, he remedied the debts, he encouraged the development of agriculture. So such methods, actions can directly benefit the people. So which make him the guy who put this into practice. And at the end, it highlighted that at the end, he has gained enormous support from regional rulers in the east coast of the Yellow River. So, which make him success, the result of the practice of those political ideology. And the text reflects the memory of Duke Wen that the narrative chose to remember. So when constructing the prince as an ideal ruler that embodied certain novel political thoughts, the narrative seems to neglect certain facts that deviated from its agenda. For example, in Shuo Yuan, it actually tells a different story, which makes the Duke Wen not that great. So the narrative actively neglects such the alternative version of stories. And as we can see, there are various ways to construct the memory of Prince Chong'er. The first is interpretation. So that means use these didactic sayings to provide excuses for the imperfection of the Prince Chong'er. And the second one is called selection. That means those negative aspects that might undermine the argumentative agenda have been actively neglected. So here comes my conclusion. And as we can see, the didactic elements plays an important role in constructing the imperfect Prince Chong'er as a model that represents the ideal governance. And what I want to emphasize is that this combination of texts also reveal the evaluation of political thoughts during the Warring State period. So that is the shift from the endorsement from heaven to the mind of people. And such thought, to some extent, accord with what Mengzi said, 保民而望, which means rules by protecting the people. That was demonstrated in his dialogue with the Qi Xuan Wang, King Xuan of Qi. So as we can see, both Qinghua manuscripts and manuscripts tend to promote the same ideology. However, they adopt different approaches towards the Duke Wen of Jing as an historical figure. So manuscripts is Mengzi established Duke Wen as a representation of the type of ruler who governs by power, or 霸道 instead of virtue. By contrast, the Qinghua manuscript portray Duke Wen of Jing as a ruler who actively practiced the way of ruling by virtue and had the support of his people. So that demonstrated how the historical figures in the past, their memory could be reconstructed in order to support the current political agenda and serve for argumentative purposes. So that's the end of my presentation. Thanks.
Shangyu is going to join us for the Q&A session, I believe. And so now we will turn to our final paper. Sarah Sweeney is going to address us on gender mainstreaming in water resources management in contemporary Thailand in civil society discourse. Thank you, Sarah.
All right, can y'all see that okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. So hello everyone, my name is Sarah. I'm currently studying at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and today I'll be presenting on gender mainstreaming and water resources management in Thailand, civil society perspectives. And I'm so sorry, I won't be able to touch on media technology much, but I'm very happy to be here, and I hope this topic is still of interest to some of you. So when I first started this project, I was initially interested in the following factors: increasing water scarcity in the occurrence of natural disasters such as flooding in rural Thailand from the impact of climate change and human development, the fact that women and girls continue to make up a significant portion of all farmers in rural Thailand, and many of the time they're engaged in wet rice agriculture. And despite increased opportunities in education and non-farm work, women continue to be missing in decision-making roles in the Thai water sector. And as a result, executive decisions made about water are predominantly made by men. So this is just a brief overview before I get started. I'll first be going over my research objectives and my arguments, and I'll then go into some background information about gender mainstreaming and water resources management, followed by current limitations and implementation and their impacts based on my own research, and then a brief summary of my study results, and finally my discussion and conclusion. My research questions are: 1, according to civil society experts, why has gender mainstreaming and water resources management been limited in Thailand? And 2, to what extent is gender mainstreaming an appropriate concept for Thailand? So as a Western concept, is it suitable for the cultural context of Thailand? And my scope is North and Northeast Thailand, their gender relations and how it's been impacted by current approaches to water resources management. And for my study, I remotely conducted semi-structured in-depth interviews with 5 civil society experts from Thailand, from NGO and academic backgrounds with experience in gender, water, and political issues. So I argue that current limitations in gender mainstreaming efforts stem from a lack of consideration for Indigenous conceptions of gender. And how this varies with culture and religion and region in the country, a lack of consideration for the persistence of traditional gender norms in rural areas, specifically the sexual division of labor between female reproductive roles and male productive roles, the dominance of technocracy and engineering in the Thai water sector, and a lack of gender expertise overall in the country. I also argue that gender mainstreaming is seen by civil society experts as highly appropriate to Thailand, but that more integration and research is required. So what is gender mainstreaming? The UN defines gender mainstreaming as the process of assessing the implications for women and men of any planned action, including legislation, policies, or programs in all areas and at all levels. And the ultimate goal is to achieve gender equality. Gender mainstreaming was endorsed at the 1995 Fourth World Conference on Women, and Thailand was one of the countries that adopted the resultant Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, and has since placed more emphasis on women's issues in national development plans. So Thailand has supported the goals of integrated water resources management, which is another UN concept, since the Dublin Principles meeting in 1992. It is defined as a process which promotes the coordinated development and management of water, land, and related resources. And there are 5 principles to IWRM. The third is that women play a central part in the provision, management, and safeguarding of water. Decentralization has been a big part of Thailand's IWRM strategy, with a focus on the river basin as a main unit of analysis. So the map here shows the different river basins throughout the country. In terms of organizational structure in Thailand's water sector, the most powerful and important organization is the Rural Irrigation Department, which has been active since 1927. And it focuses largely on construction and engineering of water infrastructure. The Department of Water Resources was established in 2002 with IWRM in mind, and they are tasked with the administration of river basin committees, which are made up of representatives at the local level. And finally, the Office of Natural Water Resources was established in 2017 and similarly works on IWRM development. And it is comprised of members from both the Royal Irrigation Department and the Department of Water Resources. So based on my own research, here are some of the current limitations and implementation and impacts. So briefly, most high-ranking positions are occupied by men, while most low-ranking positions are occupied by women in civil service in those organizations I just mentioned. There are a lack of gender dimensions and institutional changes at all levels. And by this, I mean that these organizations lack gender-specific elements and gender perspectives. So for instance, the river basin committees, which were supposed to help promote public participation, are usually comprised of elite males from local areas, partly because nothing has been done substantially to increase the incentives for women to participate. And finally, implementation is limited by a lack of gender expertise within the country. Some impacts to consider are that the needs of women and girls are neglected since these perspectives are lacking. There are increased gendered burdens placed on women who continue to work to simultaneously work and be primary caretakers. And these needs are left unaddressed. And as a result, resources for women and girls are misplaced or are lacking. So this is just a brief summary of my study results. But based on my interviews, I received some of the following explanations. For possible root causes, the persistence of traditional social structure in rural areas was mentioned, largely due to the persistence of smallholding as a dominant social form. Gender roles and expectations have by and far not changed much in the countryside. Many women are primary caretakers for children and elderly family members, while also taking up wage labor and farm work. So usually they don't have much time to attend village meetings. Buddhism was also mentioned as a factor in reference to the ordination of men into the Buddhist Sangha or monkhood, which excludes women. And men are expected to take up roles in spiritual and political affairs generally, while women are expected to take up roles in trade and the private sphere. The perception of gender equality also exists, not only because women have major roles in the household and the farm in rural areas, but also because Thai women have made significant strides in the past few decades due to development initiatives. For instance, when people in Thailand think of gender issues, they usually think of gender violence or human trafficking, but not so much environmental concerns. Some points of weakness in implementation include limited research and training on gender, the fact that the engineering field dominates the water sector, but tends to leave out sociocultural considerations, the fact that addition is being emphasized instead of integration. So one of my participants noted that Western approaches tend to work by adding criteria, and this can in turn turn off engineers to gender mainstreaming because they see it as an additional burden that they need to take responsibility for. And some recommendations that were mentioned were to improve education and resources on gender, to frame gender mainstreaming as inclusive to everyone, and in doing so account for differences in gender, class, culture, able-bodiedness, etc. And that the focus should not be on headcounts, but rather integration. However, quotas can still be a useful tool. Gender mainstreaming was endorsed by all of the study participants as crucial to the advancement of integrated water resources management and sustainable long-term solutions. But more emphasis in research and the inclusion of sociocultural considerations and diverse perspectives is needed. A couple of participants did mention that there was good potential in realizing these improvements, since the idea of river basin committees provide a good basis for public participation, and because technocrats have been receptive to gender considerations. There was a participant who noted that there are engineers who felt that it gave their work a sense of more meaning. And finally, gender equality concerns do seem to be gaining a lot of traction in recent years. Many women are leading environmental movements. So this photo to the top left is from a protest last year for more gender equality and natural resources management. And finally, the younger generation is more concerned and interested in gender issues generally. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you, all of you. That was a very enlightening, I should say, hour that we spent. So I'd like now to open the floor to discussion. We have about 15 minutes or so, roughly. Is that correct, Caitlin? Yeah, so please, if you ask a question, please very briefly identify yourself and your institution, and please keep your questions short. So well, perhaps I can start first of all. So I thought Nicole and Joita's papers really interlocked. They had a lot to say to each other. And Xiangyu's had a clearly strong message that's remained very stable throughout time, I think, the idea of the ideal ruler. But I wanted to ask both of you, in the particular episodes that you looked at, do you feel that the texts are conveying a message of some kind? And would readers, what would there be, or listeners, what would there be kind of takeaway from these performances, and would that change over time? And then my question for Xiangyu, I was really intrigued by these bamboo manuscripts, or you call them bamboo slips at one stage. And I was just wondering, how are they preserved? And were they also recited orally, I assume, rather than read? I mean, for historians, recapturing sound is really a problem. We can't do that. We can't. So that's a kind of element that we're reading rather than hearing. And then finally with Sarah, I was very intrigued. You didn't bring it up in your recommendations, but you did mention that incentives should be provided to get more women into positions of influence. So what kind of incentives do you think could be offered to persuade women to take on sometimes problematic positions? So perhaps Nicole and Joita, you could start off. Joita, what would you like to say?
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, so each of the media that I took up, they, as I have mentioned earlier, they explain or they narrate the same episode, which is the disrobing of Draupadi, but in different ways. How do they differ? Because see, like the Baluchari saris, I mean, the embroidery and the laterite plaque and everything, like they are done by different sculptors, and like they always include their own creativity, their own understanding of the episode into it. So necessarily each and every media, they differ. About the text in particular, not like it conveys a different message, but probably it narrates the same episode in a different way. Specifically, the text was designed for children. The name is Children's Illustrated Mahabharata. So, to entertain children, it speaks of like Draupadi. I mean, when Lord Krishna is providing Draupadi with saris, the saris are of different colors. Maybe that's the ludic element to entertain children. That's how, I mean, the text in particular could be differentiated from the rest of the media.
But I think I don't want to prolong it, but what I was thinking when I said message, is it about the purity of women? Is it about men shouldn't do this sort of thing? I mean, there's a message there. Maybe Nicole, you could pick that up. Is there a message in Hikayat?
Absolutely. So I just wanted to talk about the message of Hikayat in two ways. The first is the most sort of surface moral way that we can discuss adat or Malay custom. And the Hikayat and the Hikayat genre in general was effective for admonishing, for teaching people. I noted some literature that spoke of how religious leaders would consider Hikayat to be a viable source by which people could learn morality if Islamic books were too heavy for them. So there is that aspect to its form, but specific to certain forms of Hikayat, actually, I've been thinking about something even deeper, that moral is itself a medium or a piece of media technology. So there is a sort of encyclopedic impulse in Hikayat, like the one that I studied, wherein they would detail certain procedures for getting things done. For example, there would be a detailed procedure on how to chew betel properly. There'd be a detailed procedure on how to conduct a wedding. And other scholars have argued that this was sort of central to the Hikayat, that the Hikayat form was sort of a human index or a narrative index for an encyclopedia of manners, But specific to the historical form, I want to draw on the work of Mikhail Bakhtin here, where he talks about the chronotope of the novel. And in one part of his work, he talks about how in certain forms, in certain literary forms, one needs to envision the future in terms of the past in order to then successfully will come up with an idea of what the future might look like, because the future lacks sort of material weight, and therefore one has to ground it in thick descriptions of the material past. And I think that Adat is precisely that material weight that is lent to a hikayat like this, that is trying to envision a political future, where it goes into deep detail about certain forms of moral messaging, but explored in the idiom of the past, explored in the idioms of how to chew betel or how to conduct a wedding, and all this forms sort of a material weightiness. From then, the hikayat is able to make claims about the future, but through this sort of imagination of the past. And so, yeah, so I think, yes, there is a message in hikayat, and the message itself is sort of this medium of historical argumentation.
Thank you. We can, Jojo, let me just turn again to Shangyu. Is he here?
I don't think
you don't think so.
Here, Xiangyu, if you're here, you can just go ahead and say something.
Maybe not.
Yeah.
So Sarah, what do you think kind of incentives could be offered to women?
Something that was mentioned by one of my study participants was that only around 10% of women lead research projects in water resources management. So trying to encourage more female researchers, typically through research grants. So that could be an incentive. And I mentioned also that headcounts weren't emphasized as a tool for the participants, but that quotas could still be useful. And I think this is helpful because there was also a participant who noted that a lot of women don't have the confidence to be vocal about issues they might be experiencing. It's not a common like image or experience to be vocal as a woman. So I think quotas and also research grants could be incentives.
Quotas research, yes, I know with the campaign, with the family planning campaign, one of the things that they did as an incentive was to give women pigs or hairdressing appointments, all kinds of things like that. But research grants, of course, are obviously more powerful, and you can become a kind of patron in your own area if you've got money. So, Joyita, I sort of cut you off because I wasn't sure about the time, but I don't know whether you want to say anything more about, I mean, for example, with your comments, for example, you know, I was interested in the sari you showed. Is that worn at a particular, who would wear that with this image of a woman? When and who would wear that?
So am I audible now?
Yes.
Okay. So there is no particular occasion for that. I mean, it's not very occasion specific or maybe some religion specific. I mean, anyone who wishes to, you know, wear that can do that. That's about the sari. And I think I would like to add something more about the previous question that you asked.
Yes, yes.
Talking about messages, messages of any kind are supposed to emerge from one's own responsive reception. The fact that I was talking about in my presentation, that is, whatever you think probably would be the most suitable message. For instance, why I chose this particular episode of the disrobing of Draupadi and not any other episode of the Mahabharata was to point out that should you be really doing that? because people who disrobed her were, people of a royal family. So is that how you represent your royalty? That's that is the message that I wanted to bring forward. But then, yeah, others could have different of their own, depending on their responsive reception.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I've talked far too much. Do we have some more questions from the audience? Well, I think I'm going to come on stage again. This is just small little questions. What struck me particularly, Nicole, was just because I'm interested in conversion, was the very brief message that the Portuguese princess just says, well, I'm going to become Muslim. When you think about the traditional hikayats, when somebody becomes Muslim, it's a big deal. There's miracles and dreams and all kinds of things. So there's clearly been some sort of shift in that too. And then if I could go back to Joyita again, in your last display of the digital forms, it is bringing everything together. It's true, but it's in a very kind of a shocking format if you're a sort of classical scholar to think of the figures in the Mahabharata being presented in that kind of almost anime kind of form. Could be very disturbing in a way to some people. It's not only what you take from it, but it's how it's presented to you that's so influential. And then just one more for Sarah, if we've got time. We've got about 4 minutes, so you'll have to be very short. But this is just a comment, not a question. But if you look at historical material, you can see that in the past, women were actually quite important in water management. They planted the rice in irrigated fields. If the fields were irrigated, they collected the water. They were quite, water is female after all. And so it's very strange that this exclusion from water management has somehow happened over time. And I wonder whether a lot of occurred with land registration, which often tends to be in the male name, whereas in much of Thailand in the past, the land itself passed through the female line. So that was just a thought I had. So I think we've got, sorry, about 3 minutes left. So you've got 1 minute each. So Nicole, do you want to say anything?
Yes, I guess I should get started, and I'll speak really quickly now. So yeah, this is really interesting, and admittedly, I haven't considered it very deeply, but what the Hikayat Anggun Cik Tunggal seems to be doing is that it's depicting this moment of conversion as an individual choice. When this Portuguese princess becomes engaged to Anggun Cik Tunggal and they get married, she recites a pantun saying that I will forsake my mother and my father, though their fury, and I will enter your religion. And that's about it. The main basis for her conversion is love in this pantun, rather. So I wonder if this hikayat is characteristic of a sort of later Malay narrative form that's quite different from earlier predecessors. The hikayat that I was referring to was printed in 1914, narrated by a Pawang Malay Sufi miracle worker in either the late 19th century or the early 20th century, or the early 1900s. So perhaps we can sort of date it to that point, but thank you for your question. Yes. Signing off now. I don't think we have time.
So, Joyita, do you want to say anything more? I see.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. So no, nothing more about probably I couldn't elaborate much because of time constraints. If anyone's interested, you can definitely, get in touch with me. I can share my email ID. It was there on my presentation if you have noted, or maybe, we could have a virtual discussion or virtual meet. And this was a fantastic conference. Many thanks to the organizing committee.
Thank you. And so I think we've almost reached the end of our time. We have do you want to say anything more, Sarah?
No, I think I'll definitely look at more substantive incentives that could empower just like the lay woman at the local level and the rural level. And I think that's really important. So thank you for your comments. And then for sure, land registration played a big role.
Yeah. So I think we've actually reached the magic hour. We could keep on talking for a while, but we'll probably all turn into pumpkins if we stay much longer. So thank you, everybody. Thank you all for coming. And thank you again to Caitlin and Tasha for putting together a really interesting conference that's spread across the world. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Andaya, and thank you to all our participants. I see that there's some discussion going on in the chat about wanting to ask more questions, which is great. So yeah, if you want to continue having a discussion with the participants, your fellow participants, or if you are an audience member and you want to ask a participant a question, go ahead and share your email address. I'll actually put mine in there too, just in case you want to get in touch with me about anything related to the conference. Or if there's a panelist that you think of a question and you didn't get a chance to ask them, or you kind of want to get in touch with them, you can go ahead and email me. But with that, we'll have a short 15-minute break, and then we'll have panel 4, Education Technology in Asia. So if you're able to stay for the next panel, that'll be fantastic, and we'll see you in 15 minutes.
Thank you.